So, first thing we're going to deal with is qualification of the expert. And you may get questions on this. The presentation is entitled Surviving Cross-Examination, but you're going to get asked a lot of the same questions during depositions. And oftentimes what will happen is an attorney will try and get a sense of your qualifications during deposition as well as voir dire at trial. So this can actually cover both areas. One of the key areas that they're going to ask you about is your experience or lack thereof. So you might get a series of questions. Mr. Expert, you're not a full-time appraiser, isn't that true? How many hours do you really work in valuation on an annual basis? How many valuations have you performed? How many valuations have you performed for non-litigation purposes? Miles, what are we trying to do here as an attorney?
Well, it's a three-dimensional Rubik's Cube. One is, are you laying a groundwork for a beauty contest where my expert's just better than yours?
Yep.
And then the other thing is, this is going to sound awful, but the truth of the matter is many experts, especially who are not experienced in testifying, freeze on the basic questions. And I'm just looking for, are they engaged? Have they had the I can tell in 5 minutes whether they've had training or not. Have they been to NACPA? Have they been to the CPA expert? And that's what I'm trying to gauge there. Now the third thing is possibly if my expert has a lot more experience in that particular industry, of course I'm going to use that. And so that's why, if you've been trained on what to answer and you haven't done evaluation in that particular industry before, well, I'm going to see if that's a soft spot. But not only am I listening to what you say, I'm looking to your nonverbals. Is what I really am doing. I'm going to spend a lot of time queuing to find out when you pucker. And that's when I know to dig in. More questions about industry experience, being new. And the tough thing is, one of the themes about my speaking is for the younger people or less experienced folks, they misjudge the importance of this. It may not be important at all. But again, I'm looking for weakness.
Yeah. I want to follow up on that point because a lot of you in here, I see a lot of gray hair and receding hairlines like my own. You've been through this. But for the younger folks coming up, some of these questions can be fairly intimidating. The thing I always try and remember is everybody has to start somewhere.
Yeah.
There's always a first time. That's the thing to keep uppermost in your mind if you're a younger person just starting out. Shannon or Kevin, anything additionally?
Yeah, so I had this come up recently. It was a valuation in an industry that I had not done evaluation in that industry. So in the course of my work, I had, bought a BVR special report about valuation in that industry, and I'd attended a webinar. Well, that had come out on direct. So then across, the attorney really sneeringly says, "You had to go to a class, didn't you?" And I said, "Well, I did attend a webinar, but I've valued dozens of physician practices, and when I value a physician practice next year, I'll go to another webinar because I like to know the most up-to-date information, what other experts are saying in the field." So the attorney actually gave me a little pat on the back after that, so at least on that question, I held my own.
Miles has a follow-up point.
Yeah, and don't underestimate the importance of attendance. One of my favorite things, there's one forensic accountant in this audience who testified before being the most experienced testifier in the history of Tennessee. Bring up conference attendance, the training you had, the class that you had with that. Bring it up, and there's more on your resume than you could possibly already imagine that's very important. Just, in addition to the credentials, because remember, experience is something that gets a function of time. But education and training is very, very real. And again, you start off with the CPA, boom, boom, you're an expert in the courtroom. So, but before your testimonies, and also get some articles published and some writing in. But the little things matter, and it will help you out in that situation.
Kev, anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, we've kind of nibbled around this, don't make it into a bigger deal than it is. You're perfectly imperfect. Nobody can know everything, and I usually figure, if you want to spend your limited time going into this stuff and waste it, you can't use it on something else. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, I tend to think that the time to cure those weaknesses is not when you're sitting on the witness stand. You should be thinking about, if you're going to be testifying, if you look at your background and there are holes there, take care of it before you're in a courtroom. Because at that point, hey, you know what? If you don't have experience in that industry, 90% of the theory of valuation applies in every single valuation.
Exactly.
Cash flow.
One thing I like to remember are the federal rules and the criteria used to qualify an expert. In most states, statutes and case law tend to follow the federal rules as well, but there's an acronym called SKEET. Skills, knowledge, experience, education, and training.
Yep.
And you don't have to fulfill all 5 of those criteria, but if you fulfill the majority of them, guess what? You've qualified as an expert.
And if you're a CPA, you've probably satisfied.
Right. Miles alluded to that earlier in his presentation, where he said there had not been a CPA, based on his research, that had been excluded. So something to keep in mind, and going back to Kevin's point, you really never should get to this point. You should be prepared when you walk into that deposition or on the stand, if it's voir dire, to be able to address those kinds of questions.
Now, there is an exception, and that if you haven't read Powell v. Powell that Rob talks about at every conference, and there's a good reason he talks about it at every conference, is because it's an amazing case. But in a footnote, they did have a reference to the beauty contest and that Mr. Vance's credentials, or the other experts' credentials, paled in comparison to Rob's, but that was because the CPA, who was still admitted as an expert, gave an opinion on the business valuation, but had no business valuation training, and the business was his client.
Right.
And the husband was a client. So,
It goes towards weight.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
They'll
yeah.
let anybody in, it just goes towards weight.
Yeah, so I'm not saying. No, Powell v. Powell. We need to go back and revisit it. Now, is it true at your office that there's an altar to that?
It's like one of my first testimonies too.
It was your first appellate opinion of many,
I
because
was scared to death. I mean, scared to death. Dan Taylor against me, one of the most experienced, mean guys in Memphis. He's battled out in his old age. Man, I was terrified.